Welcome to the second to last day of the summer school. The speaker today at 9 o'clock will be Blake Richards, who is Associate Professor in the School of Computer Science and Montreal Neurological Institute at McGill University and a core faculty member at MILA, co-sponsor of this summer school. Blake's research is at the intersection of neuroscience and AI, artificial intelligence. His laboratory investigates universal principles of intelligence applied to both natural and artificial agents. He has received several awards for his work, which include the NSERC Arthur B. MacDonald Fellowship in 2022, the Canadian Association for Neuroscience Young Investigator Award in 2019, and a CFAR Canada AI chair in 2018. I know that it's tedious for you, Blake, to hear all of these things. I now pass it to you. Blake will be giving a talk on revisiting the Turing test in the age of large language models, which has been touched in several other talks in this series. Blake has not yet seen the other talks, but I asked him to give it as if you didn't know what the Turing test was about. It's all yours, Blake.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. It's nice to be with you all. And I will, as Stephen instructed, give the talk in full ignorance of what previous speakers have told you about the Turing test. Though, given the fact that you're all familiar with it, I also won't belabor the basic stuff regarding it. So yeah, it's, I think, a really exciting time to be in this area, to be studying these questions. And today I want to give you a more sort of philosophical talk regarding what I think is a shift in mindset that would ideally happen in our field, given the advances that have happened with large language models in recent years. So, to begin with, I want to start by talking about the role of definitions in science. So definitions in science matter. Science is fundamentally a social endeavor. I think a lot of people forget this. There's this dream we have of some kind of, committed genius toiling away in a laboratory by themselves, coming up with the next grand theory or the experiments that prove something radically different than what everyone had thought before. But really, that's not how science works. If you look at all of the major advances that ever happened in science, they were the result actually of a steady, progressive process of people building on previous advances and people talking to each other and coming up with new ideas as a community of individuals trying to figure out how the world actually works. So it's only through dialogue with each other that we can do science, and therefore you need to have a shared language. It's impossible to do science without a shared language. And as such, definitions do matter. Exactly what we mean by words matters when we're trying to engage in science. Now, it's worth noting that we can have multiple overlapping definitions, some of them technical, some of them non-technical, and that's okay. Everyone's familiar with the old thing that, you tell a kid that actually a tomato's a fruit, not a vegetable. And they're kind of like, what? And it violates their understanding of the definition of fruit and vegetable. But of course, it's okay. It doesn't really matter. We can have these different use cases and these different situations where sometimes one group of people means something by a given word, and other times another group of people means something different. So I also want to clarify that I'm not arguing, when I argue for the importance of definitions, that we have to have one monolithic definition for things. But nonetheless, within a given scientific practice, we at least need some consistent definitions. The participant small icon screen. Oh, okay, I see. Yes, very good. I can do that. No, this is here. Is that better now?
That's partly better.
Yes, oh, this is still here as well.
Yeah. Okay, that looks good.
I'll put it down here. It's at least better down here, I think, will be less disruptive.
I don't know if you can see, there's also a word to word, a dictator transcript over there going, so we have to move that around so you can be seen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I do not see that, so I can't move that around,
Okay, I'll
unfortunately.
adjust it. It's okay. Sorry to
Okay.
interrupt you. Go ahead.
No worries. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about how words get defined. Putting all my cards on the table, I personally think that Wittgenstein's later takes on this are the best. I think they clearly align with how things really happen in the real world. And in particular, what Wittgenstein argued was that in most cases, the meaning of a word is ultimately determined by the way we use it. So whatever role the word plays in our language games, that is implicitly its definition. So really, most words are defined implicitly this way, right? We don't, as children, read the dictionary to understand the words we're using. We just use the words, and in doing so, we illustrate our understanding of the definition. Now, of course, within science, sometimes we do have explicit definitions, and that's all well and good. But I still think the question of use plays a big part when we're talking about the definition of words in science, because even if we articulate an explicit definition, due to the social nature of science, it doesn't matter that you might have articulated an explicit definition for something if others don't use the word in that way. So no matter what your sort of pet definition of something is, if other scientists aren't engaged in its usage in the same way, it doesn't mean that. You can't just impose that on everyone else. And we're going to come back to this question later on, because this is, I think, one of the key mistakes that, frankly, a lot of academics make in this sphere. I'm just going to check this Q&A. There will appear to remove floating options. Oh, okay, very good. Disable annotation for others. I don't actually see that, but I'm just going to continue as is. If there are big issues, let me know. All right. So for my talk today, I want to first talk about the question of how we define thought, and specifically talk about the Turing test as a benchmark approach to this question of how we define thought. And I'm going to talk about the status of the Turing test today in the age of large language models. Then I'm going to turn to this question of understanding, which is obviously a big focus of this summer school, and something that I imagine you've heard other speakers speak about so far. And I'm going to ask whether you'd actually want a Turing test for understanding, and what would happen if we had one in terms of our understanding of other human beings, particularly as AI advances. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about how we define life, or rather don't define life. And I'm going to argue that actually, as with the case of life, the definitions of the words think or understand will never actually receive a scientific one, and we'll have to just be satisfied with the common usage definition we receive from other human beings rather than having a technical one. All right, let's start with the Turing test. You, of course, know about the Turing test. And, Turing proposed it in his very important and fascinating article from 1950 on machine intelligence. If you haven't read this article, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a fascinating article, both just because it touches on interesting topics, but also it's remarkably prescient. Turing basically predicts the current approach to AI, which is to rely on learning machines. But let's talk about what Turing was actually trying to do in this essay. So he wanted to ask the question, can a machine think? But he was very clear about the fact that he didn't have a definition of the word think. And he didn't want to simply rely on popular usage. So he proposed to replace the question itself with an empirical test. That is, sidestep the question, can a machine think, and instead provide a scientific test that would sort of gesture towards whether a machine can think, even if it can't be asked directly. And of course, as you all know, Turing's proposal was a modern twist on an old Victorian parlor game that he called the imitation game. So the original Victorian parlor game, reflecting the highly gendered society of the time, was to have a man and a woman in separate rooms that could pass notes back and forth between a judge. And the judge's job was to figure out which was the man and which was the woman. And I believe in the original game, it was the man's goal to fool the judge, and it was the woman's goal to get them to get the correct answer. And so, of course, the man's goal then is to try to say things that make it seem like he is a woman, etc. In the case of the Turing test, Turing's idea was, well, let's just do this with a machine. If you have a machine engaged in a text-based conversation with someone, and that person cannot actually identify whether they're speaking with a machine or a person, then Turing argued, you've got basically something that, for all intents and purposes, thinks. Even if we can't say explicitly that it thinks, we can at least say that the way that it behaves aligns very well with how we tend to use the word think and how people tend to react when they're engaging in a linguistic conversation with another agent. Now, we're in an interesting phase in AI development. I'll tell you, when I was a student in artificial intelligence and cognitive science many years ago, the way that we learned about the Turing test was that basically it was going to never be passed, or at least not within our lifetimes. The feeling was, at that point in time in the early 2000s, was that AI had been a failure largely. I'll say it was actually a very disheartening time to be a student in AI. My entire undergrad basically consisted of being told, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work, this doesn't work. And you sort of had this impression that like the entire field of AI was just one big hoax, and nothing was going to work. So, it's fascinating for me that we are now at the point, 2 decades later, where we really do have AI systems that, for all intents and purposes, pass the Turing test. Now, I know people can maybe argue about that a little bit, but look, I can tell you that as a student in 2002, I would have been very satisfied with current large language models as passing the Turing test. Certainly, it was they're well beyond any level of sophistication in the Turing test than I could have ever have imagined we'd be at within my lifetime. Here's an example interaction with a large language model engaged in a sort of classic Turing test like back and forth. There are some key things that make it good here in terms of its ability to pass the Turing test. The model's able to talk about like things that would reasonably put a dog in a bad mood. Reason about why animals don't generally have 3 legs. It's pretty good. Moreover, there's this question of joke explainability. So my old professor, Jeff Hinton, talks in some of his recent talks about how joke comprehension was like a big red line for him with AI. He had kind of assumed that AI wouldn't be able to do joke comprehension for a long, long time. And when he first started interacting with large language models that were able to actually explain jokes, he was blown away. And I will say that, I can think back to, I know this is in part in memorial of Dan Dennett. One of my favorite passages in Dan Dennett's work that as a young student helped me to understand the challenge that we faced was when he talked about getting an AI system to explain a joke in the Turing test, and how he traced out all of the things that a machine would have to have knowledge about, it seems, to actually explain a joke. Here's an example. This was me asking the Turing test, asking ChatGPT, my friend Guillaume's favorite terrible dad joke. Why did the blind woman walk into a well? She didn't see that well. And ChatGPT does an excellent job of explaining the joke. The key is to understand the double meaning of the word well. It both is an adverb meaning, good, and also a well as in an object that you get water out of and as a hole in the ground. So these systems can do things that many people thought, in terms of the Turing test, were going to likely be impossible. Now, of course, they're not perfect. Here's another joke, and I won't belabor this one. There's a lot of text on this slide, and my apologies. But basically, I'll tell you the joke. So it's this man walks into a pub, and he says, "Give me 3 pints of Guinness, please." The bartender brings it to him. He sips one, then all the others, and the bartender says, basically, like, what's going on? And the man says, "Oh, well, I have 2 brothers, one in Australia and one in the States, and we made a vow every Saturday night. Since we can't drink together in person, we're going to have 3 Guinness stouts together, and it'll be as if we were together." The bartender says, "Oh, this is wonderful. That's a nice tradition." And one week, the man comes in and orders just 2 drinks, and he drinks them and then orders 2 more. And the bartender says, "Oh, I'm sorry that one of your brothers died." And the man replies, "Oh, my brothers are fine. I just quit drinking." So the joke, of course, is that the man has not quit drinking because he's still drinking these Guinnesses, but he's implying that the reduction in beers was the removal of his beer within it. But ChatGPT didn't actually get this. ChatGPT's explanation was the joke is funny because it has a surprising punchline. The punchline effectively subverts the expectations, but it never actually mentions the fact that the key is that the man hasn't actually quit drinking. But regardless, I will say not all people can explain jokes well. And so and we're going to return to this. If we're actually applying consistent tests on people and AI, the fact that sometimes these systems get it wrong is not too worrying. I would still say they basically passed the Turing test. Now, let's talk about this question of benchmarks. So what Turing had done was basically set up a benchmark. He basically said, like, here is an explicit empirical metric, which would be something like the percentage of people who are fooled by the machine, that we can use to measure the degree to which a machine thinks. And that core philosophy remains intact within AI. AI, as a field, loves benchmarks, explicit metrics, whether it be the ability to categorize on a particular image data set, the ability to answer questions within a particular question and answer corpus, the ability to correctly caption images within a VQA data set, whatever. AI loves data sets. And the nature of the game in AI often nowadays is basically demonstrating that your model is state of the art on various relevant benchmarks for the cognitive functions that you're interested in replicating. And it should be noted that brain science, cognitive science, psychology, neuroscience, they also love benchmarks. We use benchmarks to measure people's abilities to think all the time. Cognitive assessments are critical. Here I've got an image from the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is used in part to determine whether or not someone's developing dementia. And it really is hard to imagine psychology and cognitive neuroscience without benchmarks. So benchmarks themselves are fine. Benchmarks are a way of getting an empirical measure of the capabilities of the system. But what I'm going to argue over the next little bit is that benchmarks should not be used as a replacement for definitions. It's good to use benchmarks to measure abilities of systems, but Turing's decision to use it as a replacement for a definition was, I think, misguided. And I say that with a great deal of caution because I never inclined to contradict someone as smart as Alan Turing. But I think that in this particular case, he got it wrong by taking that turn. And I'll come back to why in a moment. But let's talk about benchmarks. So one of the things that we've seen with large language models is now that they can pass the Turing test, people said, well, okay, so they can come across as human in conversation, but that's just them engaged in a simulacrum of conversational style. They've just learned the sort of statistics of what people tend to say. So, you know, it's not that they actually have thought. It's not that they actually have cognition. And when people said that, many researchers said, well, let's actually test it. Let's go use all of these cognitive benchmarks that we have in psychology and cognitive neuroscience to actually assess whether these machines have similar cognitive abilities to humans. So here's just one example from a paper from Binns and Schultz, where they applied a series of cognitive tests to AI systems, in this particular case, GPT-3. And it's a test that they use with humans in various psychology experiments. The idea is that you have two slot machines, and you have to, so you're going to see a series of polls on the slot machines with different payouts, and then you have to decide which slot machine to pull. Now, there are there are different horizons, quote unquote, that you can give the task. And what that means is that you can say to people, okay, here are the series of polls. So first, you know, you saw machine one get pulled, then machine two, then machine two, then machine one. These were the payouts. Now, if the horizon is one, you get one pull of the machines. Alternatively, if the horizon is six, you're going to get six pulls on the machine. And there were random explorations, directed explorations. That's not super important, but you get the idea for the task. Basically, what they're trying to do is they're trying to assess people's abilities to actually judge utility. So to make a sort of personal internal calculation on what is the most likely result to give me maximal payout. And what you can see with human beings is that they will indeed pick the machine that is, statistically speaking, more likely to give a payout based on the data that you give them. And so does GPT-3. So here are the specific, here's an example of some of that quantification. So the mean regret is measuring essentially the extent to which they choose the correct slot based upon the statistics of the data they've received. And here we're looking, trial refers to the trial within the horizon. So if it's a Horizon 1 task, there's only one data point here. And if it's a Horizon 6 task, there's 6 data points. And what you can see in the squares here are the Horizon 1 results. So when you just give one chance at a pull on the machine, humans and GPT-3 actually pick the statistically correct machine the same percentage of the time. So at face value, it looks like GPT-3 is perfectly capable of solving this task. It can assess the relative balance of payouts between the two slots, and it seems to know that it should pick the one that has had a better statistical payout. Now, that doesn't mean that it's exactly like human beings. An interesting difference emerges when we look at the Horizon 6 cases. In the case of human beings, humans engage in a little bit more exploration when they know that this is a multi-pole.
I barely have to even talk on this panel tonight.
Oh, sorry. Can someone mute themselves? I'm hearing another person's voice. Thank you. So with 6 trials, humans will engage in a bit of exploration, basically to verify the statistics, which is interesting, whereas GPT-3 doesn't. It just always goes with whatever the maximal utility is according to the initial calculation. So we can see a difference between the way people are doing this task and the way that GPT-3 is doing this task. But at the end of the day, it's not a huge difference. Okay. Now, one of the things that people have said about some of these cognitive tasks, particularly ones that involve reasoning, is that large language models fail these because they require prompting. So if you haven't seen this idea of, giving the right prompt or prompt engineering or chain of thought prompting to a machine, here's an example from a 2022 paper in Neuroscience. If you just give one of these large language models a direct prompt like this, where you ask it a question, so you say, Roger has 5 tennis balls. He buys 2 more cans of tennis balls. Each can has 3 tennis balls. How many tennis balls does he have now? The answer is 11. And then you give it another question and you ask it for the answer. It's going to do the calculation incorrectly. Here, the cafeteria had 23 apples. If they used 20 and bought 6 more, how many apples do they have? Of course, the answer is 9, because what you should be doing is subtracting 20 from 23 and then adding 6. But somehow the machine gets to 27. So it didn't do the calculation correctly. And some people say, well, therefore, these machines, don't have any ability to engage in logic. But of course, there is this interesting result that you can prompt it by basically showing it how to solve the other problem. So you say, Roger started with 5 balls, 2 cans of 3 tennis balls, each is 6 tennis balls, 5 plus 6 equals 11. You give it the chain of thought for solving the problem. And then, GPT can answer this question. It can run through the same chain of thought and arrive at the correct answer of 9 apples. Now, on face value, this seems like, well, so the system doesn't really understand. It's just copying what the prompt basically told it to do. And there's some truth to that. But that is also the case with human beings. There is a reason that we have to phrase problems in a particular way in order for people to get the correct answer. We see this all the time with human beings. You need to prompt people correctly in order for them to get the right answer. Not everyone. Some people could answer one of these questions right off the bat, but many people will require correct prompting. And for things that you might think are simpler, that you would never imagine a human being would need prompting for. Let me give you an example. Here's I forgot, there was this one video. Stephen, I don't know if we can get the sound on this. I had told you I had no videos and I lied to you. I forgot about this one video.
Have a go and see if it works.
Okay, very good. So let me play this video.
No.
Are you hearing that?
No, no sound. What's he saying?
Sorry, are you hearing that, Stephen?
No, we don't hear it. What is he saying?
Okay, here, I'm going to put on the closed caption for you. Maybe you can see it here. Okay. So hopefully you can read that there. When asked the question, if you were born 5 years ago, how old would you be? This man's answer was 24. The rest of this YouTube video is a poor young woman being asked this question repeatedly by someone and constantly coming up with the wrong answer. And if you go online, you can find video after video after video of people giving the wrong answer to, if you were born 5 years ago, how old would you be? It sounds like a pretty easy question. If you were born 5 years ago, how old would you be? The answer, of course, selection. Okay, it's okay. It doesn't matter for my purposes. It sounds like a pretty easy question. If you were born 5 years ago, how old are you? Obviously, the answer is 5. But people can't get it unless you prompt them correctly. If you ask someone, if a child was born 5 years ago, how old is that child? They would probably get the answer correctly. It's literally just like tiny shifts in prompts, and the human brain just doesn't get the logic. So the thing that I want to emphasize here is that we can define these various cognitive benchmarks and we can examine whether or not these LLMs pass them. And that's a very valid process for determining what are the actual capabilities of these systems. But I guarantee you, any benchmark you develop that current LLMs cannot pass or which future LLMs will not pass, there will be large swaths of human beings that cannot pass that benchmark. So defining new benchmarks might not be the direction we want to go for determining thought. Option number 2 is to move beyond benchmarks. So what we could instead do is we could accept some degree of ambiguity on the question of whether machines think, and simply accept that the question may not be scientifically resolvable. So, Turing wanted to replace this question with this empirical test. And as he noted, the average person's usage aligns well with the Turing test. But even if scientists, I don't think scientists want to just accept that common usage definition. But then I don't think we're going to be able to come up with an explicit test that cleanly separates out what people consider thought from non-thought. And so I think instead scientists will have to accept this as an ambiguous question, but whether society at large will is another issue that we'll return to in a moment. So let's talk about how this relates to understanding. I've seen a lot of academics argue both sides of the question of understanding. They say LLMs do understand, LLMs don't understand. And I think on the side of people who say that LLMs don't understand, one of the most common tactics, but actually on both sides, not just people who argue they don't understand, also people who argue they do understand. One of the most common tactics is that a person will provide a definition or some criteria. They will say understanding requires X, Y, Z. And then they will argue that current language models do or don't match X, Y, Z. But that's not how science works. This comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. Definitions are critical in science, and it's perfectly valid to propose a definition, but you can't just make one up and run with it and then draw conclusions from it. The value of any definition you propose is determined by how many people adopt its usage in that manner. And if people don't use it in the way that you've tried to define it, your definition is not the definition in the field and therefore doesn't matter for actually determining the question of whether a machine understands or not. It's just you speaking to yourself if your definition is not widely accepted. And sorry, I'm just checking questions there. It's not something that is, in my opinion, a valid tactic for discussion. And look, we don't have an explicit definition of understanding. I don't think that's a controversial statement. There is no widespread consensus on what constitutes understanding, and I don't see one emerging. If anything, what I see right now in the field is a fracturing of this usage of the word. Different people mean different things with it when they refer to understanding. And so then that brings us back to benchmarks. Are we going to try to develop a Turing test for understanding? Are we going to simply provide some new empirical metric? And we're going to say, if a machine passes this metric, it understands. If it doesn't pass this metric, it doesn't understand. Personally, I don't like that strategy. And it's because, as I said, I don't think many humans are going to pass many of these tests. Let me give you an example. Well, first, let's start by talking about potential tests. So here's an example of the kind of tests that people have proposed for assessing things like AI understanding. So you might have heard of these Vanguard tests before. Vanguard tests are tests where you receive a series of stimuli that have something that they share between them, and you get two sets, and your job is to figure out basically what are the shared things between the two sets of stimuli. And current AI systems are not as good as humans at these Vanguard tests, interestingly. So you can show very concretely that current systems, current visual language models do not successfully pass Vanguard tests at the same level of human beings. So many people have said, well, then great. So these Vanguard tests demonstrate a lack of understanding in these machines. There's a lack of actual understanding of, the gestalt of these stimuli, and therefore these systems don't have an understanding. But look, I'm going to tell you right now, if that's your strategy, that strategy is going to last you for a finite amount of time. AI systems are already getting better at these Vanguard tests, and I guarantee you they're going to have human level within the next 10 years, no problem. So here is a recent paper on this. You can see, the state of the art in 2021 on this particular photo-based Vanguard test. There's also the classic Vanguard tests use more abstract symbols, but it's the same thing. On this image-based Vanguard test, humans do quite well. They get in the 90% correct range. And in 2021, the state of the art in AI systems was around 60%. Well, in 3 years, we've cranked that up by 10%, and we're now at 70% for AI systems. Give it another 3 years, it'll be another 10%, and another 3 years, maybe even less, it's going to be a human level. I can pretty much guarantee you. If you give AI engineers a benchmark, they're going to pass your benchmark at some point in time. Because the principle is that you can take data and extract information from it using neural networks trained with backpropagation is sound. It just works. And it takes some engineering, but I guarantee you these benchmarks will be passed someday. And so then there might be this constant temptation to keep introducing more complex tests, more rigorous assessments of the cognitive abilities of these systems. And if the goal is simply to understand their capabilities, that's awesome. That's exactly what we should be doing. But if the goal is to replace our lack of definition of the word understand with these tests, then I think that's super problematic. And the reason is, as I said, because many people will not pass these tests. If we make new benchmarks and there are many people that don't pass the tests, are we really comfortable saying that other human beings don't understand the world? I'll give you a very explicit example. Do people with Down syndrome understand anything? I spent years as a social worker with adults with Down syndrome, and I can tell you, as far as I'm concerned, they understand a lot. They definitely think, they understand a huge amount about the world. They are cognitive agents with the full ability to perceive the world, understand it, and act in it. They don't always understand things at the same level as other people necessarily. Sometimes they understand certain things better than other people, but it's true, they have a different style of cognition, and in certain ways, their capacities are more limited. And on that note, I'm willing to bet, from having interacted with a lot of wonderful people with Down syndrome, even though they're wonderful and they understand, they probably would not be able to pass these tests that require making logical inferences or seeing connections in Vanguard problems or things like that. All these tests that we employ right now to argue that LLMs don't understand things, people with Down syndrome aren't going to pass those tests either. And I don't want to say that these people don't understand something. I'm not comfortable with that as a turn in logic in our field. So I would argue that we should just abandon benchmarks for thought and understanding. We don't have an explicit definition, and I don't think we should try to deal with that by providing these benchmarks. Well, what's the other option? Well, the other option is just to embrace the ambiguity, right? We might not have a way to scientifically determine whether an AI system thinks or understands. That's okay. So this is now where I turn to this question of taking this different approach. So why is it okay? Well, look, we did the same thing with the concept of life. For a long time, people wanted to have an explicit scientific definition of what it was to be alive. And there was, in fact, a whole field that was devoted to trying to find the life force that was supposed to be the thing that distinguished that which is alive from that which is not alive. But it didn't work. And nowadays, there are certain functions that we can point to that life forms have, like the ability to reproduce, the ability to engage in metabolic activity, etc. And so there are certain creatures that we can say those creatures are definitely alive. And then there are other things that have none of those features, and we can say those creatures are definitely not alive. So, you and I are definitely alive. Our table, the table that you're sitting at is definitely not alive. But then there are gray regions, right? Viruses have some of the machinery that life forms do, but not other components of that machinery. And therefore, we can't really say whether a virus is alive or not. And that's okay. It's not an issue. It didn't impair biology at all. Scientists just moved on and they conducted science using the definitions from our usage of the word and not worrying too much about trying to define a clear dividing line between that which was alive and that which wasn't alive. And I'm going to argue that we're going to do this with the concepts of thought and understanding. There's a lot of work for us to do to understand cognitive functions in human beings and to replicate those cognitive functions in AI. And I think, to be clear, all of this work assessing the cognitive abilities of these AI systems is super valid. It's super important. It is how we come to understand the differences between how these systems operate and how we operate, and then either close the gap or derive additional interesting theories about human cognition. And that's great. So I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be testing these systems with these cognitive tests at all. We should be. And even look, if you want to assess its ability to fool someone on a language game, I guess that's okay. Though I'm not quite sure what the point of that is anymore, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think at the end of the day, we're all going to stop worrying about whether these models think or understand, in the same way that biologists stopped worrying about which things were alive or not. And we're just going to do science in the presence of ambiguity on this question. So, this doesn't mean defeat. Biology isn't a failure due to the inability to define that which is and isn't alive. And AI or cognitive science will not be a failure because we can't say really concretely whether ChatGPT thinks or understands anything. So to wrap up, I don't think the Turing test stands anymore. No one really uses it anymore. And notwithstanding some hyperbole and speculation that you see within the AI community, most researchers in neuroscience and AI and psychology, et cetera, just get on with the science. They accept that we've got these kind of ambiguous definitions based on usage that allow us to say humans definitely understand and think, rocks definitely don't understand and think, but AI, well, we can say that it has this capability or that capability, but it's kind of an ambiguous question whether they understand or think. Now, of course, we have to recognize that the public may not accept this ambiguity. So as you may be aware, there was and this isn't even the lay public, here we're talking about engineers. There was a Google AI engineer a couple of years ago who, based on his interactions with Lambda, the large language model that had been built at Google, declared that the language model was sentient and has thoughts and started advocating for its rights. And I think that sometimes there's a desire among some people to basically have a test for these things because they're concerned with things like that question of, will the machine have rights? But I think this is the wrong way to approach that. And we can come back to that in the discussion. I think our job as scientists should instead be to consistently give a message to the public of total honesty, that we don't know what it actually means to understand or not, but we can tell you the ways in which these AI systems match human abilities and the ways in which they don't. And we just want to carve that out as explicitly as possible for everyone and not engage with the temptation to argue about whether these machines have thoughts or understand or not. So I think our real challenge is acceptance. Maybe we cannot scientifically define what it means to think. Maybe we cannot scientifically define what it means to understand. And maybe none of this matters for science. We can just move on with our empirical investigations and forget about these arguments. So that's it. Thanks for listening. And now I'm happy to engage in some Q&A.
Thank you very much. I've learned that when I say thank you to a speaker and we start to applaud, they don't hear it because of the sound filtering of the system. So
Okay,
saying thank you, and I'm going to clap, and everyone else is doing it as well.
very good. Thank you.
Okay, now, another thing I've learned through these sessions is that it doesn't work unless we use the hand signal as the cue. It becomes chaotic. So what I ask you to do is to look at the people that are putting in their written comments,
Yep.
and give them priority until hands start going up, and then I'll do it with hands.
Okay,
So
sounds good.
go ahead.
So I'll start with the question from Daniel here. So Daniel's saying, look, what if an AI passes a particular test and some humans don't? Then we can say that the AI understands that thing and the humans don't. What's wrong with that conclusion? I don't have any big problem with that conclusion, actually. I think that what I'm arguing against, because what you're doing there is you're basically just using the common usage meaning of the word understand. That's how we assess understanding in general. Like if someone gives the correct answer on something, they understand it. If they don't, they don't. And so we can say, look, this AI system understands this, and maybe these people don't understand this. That's fine. What I'm talking about here is instead the quest to make much broader statements about whether AI systems understand anything. So I think a lot of researchers are engaged in an attempt not just to argue that like ChatGPT doesn't understand that joke about the guy ordering Guinness pints, but rather that that failure illustrates a general lack of understanding in the system. And this is what I'm objecting to. So I have no problem with saying, look, the system doesn't understand this thing that it failed to answer the question correctly on. Absolutely. And likewise, like someone with Down syndrome, if I give them a math problem and they don't answer it, they don't understand the problem. That's okay. It doesn't mean they don't understand anything. So that's fine. It's that attempt to say 100% these systems don't understand anything because they don't pass these various benchmarks. That's what I object to.
Could you turn off your share, please?
Oh, sure. Okay. Next question from David. Do you not think answering the question, does LLM understand, is an important step for making policies, governance, and debating ethics around LLMs? Yeah, great. So good question. I knew we'd get this question. No, I don't think it matters. I would argue that this is never how we make policy. So ask yourself the question, how do we determine what rights, for example, to afford people or animals in our society? How has this been done both historically and in the modern day? And I will argue that it has never been about the question of, can we determine scientifically whether these things understand or not, right? I'm not allowed to go out and capture an animal in the wild and torture it, not because we've done rigorous cognitive assessments of that species' cognitive capabilities to determine whether or not it understands anything, but because our society has just determined that we now wish to afford additional rights to other creatures that have a shared physiology with us. And that's appropriate. That's fine. That's good. And likewise, like if we want to have this discussion around rights and policies and governance around LLMs, I would argue that we can make that decision without any question of whether they understand anything. We instead should make that decision based upon the principles that we want to be governing our society. So, for example, if we want to have a society where human beings have the ultimate legal and ethical status over other agents in the world, which is how our society is currently structured, then I think we don't need to worry about affording rights to LLMs, and that's okay. Alternatively, if our society evolves to the point that our understanding of rights is based upon one's ability to engage in conversation, then maybe we will want to extend it to LLMs. But I don't think, whether it's questions of abortion, whether it's questions of the legal status of someone who's committed a criminal act, etc. The way that we end up determining this stuff there's certain interesting questions within legal realms, I know, regarding like the understanding of an act. Like, did they understand that they were doing something wrong? But I think we've seen how tricky that question is, even with people, and I'm not sure it's how we should be generally determining policy with AI. Okay. Next question. Gregor. Great. Glad you agree, Gregor. Same holds for the concept of reasoning. Yeah, like I think so. I think what we can say is that, again, we could use the popular definition of the word reasoning, the usage-based definition. And in that sense, I think, we can see ways in which LLMs are capable of reasoning and other cases where they're not capable of reasoning. And certainly we can take an approach whereby we, in line with the first question I got from Daniel, we can take an approach where we say like, okay, LLMs seem to be capable of this type of reasoning, but not that type of reasoning. And this is a very valid turn. But indeed, I don't think we can ask the question, is AI capable of reasoning, period, and then use a series of benchmarks to answer that question. I think that's the wrong turn scientifically and ethically. Okay, and then B, in addition, why sticking to dogmatic definitions is societally harmful. LLMs are not understanding, they're not thinking, so can never do this or that. Reasoning along this lines has caused our societies to prepare well. Yes, right. So, I think indeed the key question is a practical one. How should we, and this gets back to the second question I had, how should we actually deal with the regulatory frameworks, the legal frameworks for AI? I think it has to be the practical question. What is best for our society? What is going to lead to the greatest level of social harmony, the greatest level of human flourishing and human happiness? That practical utilitarianism is how we should guide our policymaking decisions, I think, not these other more abstract questions. Yes, and has prevented our societies from prepare. I agree. Like the debates around AI systems, whether they understand, actually, I think distracts us from more important legal questions around like, well, what would happen if we actually gave these systems rights? Like, what would that mean in terms of the, economic and legal ramifications? And these are the questions we should be asking. What are those practical implications? Yeah. So I fully agree with you, Gregor.
So are you done with that one?
I am, yeah. Oh,
Are there any hands raised? Come up to the mic, please. Identify yourself.
Hi, thanks for the talk.
Hi.
Nicholas here, philosophy student. I'm wondering, what would you think of a thing that's really popular right now in philosophy? It's called conceptual engineering. So the general idea is use definitions as tools. So we craft them the way engineers craft tools and machines and stuff. So have definitions that serves us in a way. It's a bit of analytical philosophy meets pragmatism. So what would you think of clear-cutting our definitions to serve pragmatically our purposes?
So what I'd say is, I think that's a very valid approach, but the question of whether your definition, as you've engineered it for particular purposes, is actually useful for science is going to come down to whether or not it gets adopted by people. So you can do that, and I think that's a perfectly valid turn, but I maintain that it's only a scientifically relevant turn rather than just a philosophically interesting turn. It's only scientifically relevant if scientists widely adopt that definition.
Okay, next questioner, and then you can go back to the list because it's filling up again. Go ahead.
Sure.
I had a
Identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Sayara. I'm an undergrad at Gill, and I wanted to ask, what if we didn't use like how an LLM performed at an assessment that we have, but rather we looked at the architecture to like determine if it's thinking. Obviously, there is ambiguity in that, but what if we compared it to like how like maybe our let's say our frontal lobe worked, and then
Right.
compare the architecture of that LLM.
Right. Yeah. What I would say to that is that you are effectively providing a definition then, right? You're saying the definition of understanding is to possess this architecture. And again, if other scientists accept that definition, if that becomes the way that people start using the word, then that's perfectly valid. But I suspect you will find that people will not readily take up a definition of understand based on, say, the architecture of prefrontal cortex. There's going to be objections to that. And primarily the objection will be, well, that's not really understanding. This architecture could exist without understanding. We've seen similar things argued about subjective experience and other things like that, the presence of a particular physical architecture or even software architecture doesn't guarantee this, that, or the other. So if it was widely adopted, fine, but I think realistically it's not going to be. So I hesitate to think that that would be a way to address the problems I'm raising here.
Good. You've got your next question there from Catherine.
Great. Okay. So I think that the way that most people interpret thinking and understanding requires an agent, something that it feels like to be the thinker or understander. And as far as I understand, LLMs don't have that agency right now. I think with the general public, it's important to emphasize the lack of agency, ability to act on their own. Do you agree? So, yes and no. I half agree with you. So I agree that it is important to emphasize to the public, particularly when it comes to some of these more controversial questions around AI safety and regulation. It's important to be clear with them that the current large language models are under a tight leash in terms of their ability to act. They respond when prompted, and that's all they do. But there are AI systems that have agency, you can argue, within the virtual world that they live in, or even with some robotic systems within the real world that they live in. I don't think agency is a big dividing line between AI and humans right now. I think giving AI agency is literally just the difference between putting it out in the wild with a set of actions that allow it to engage some physical plant or some simulated plant in a simulated world. And it's not the case that that this is the dividing line between understanding and thinking. I would, because I really think these you can give agency to these AI systems. I don't think that's difficult. I agree with you that LLMs don't really have it, but that's a design choice by the engineers, not an inherent limitation of AI, is what I'd say. Okay, Anna's.
By the way, that question slipped from feeling to agency as if they were synonyms. What if we just stuck with feeling? Now, what do you say about that?
Right. So with feeling, so that's where I am, I've gone back and forth in different ways on
Do
the
you
question.
think this is a matter of opinion, Blake?
I would say that this is a matter of opinion, definitely. And I think that I don't think it's something that science can attend to. Though many people don't like this, I'm old school in this way. I think we have to accept that science can never tell us whether another individual has subjective experience. And I therefore think that either scientifically or in terms of the way that we use our words, we don't use the concept of subjective experience or feelings to hang our concept of understanding or thought on it. I think we base it instead on the material behaviors we can see individuals engage in. And that's the nature of it. That's my personal take.
Science sounds like a sort of it's meant to settle this, but I don't even know what science means, but I know what observation is. I noticed that, for example, some of the things that you said concerned observable things like water and
Yes,
rock, etc., and others that concern unobservable things, mostly these kinds of things, understanding, feeling,
Mhm.
meaning, etc., etc. Do you not acknowledge that distinction when you say that science this and science that?
Well, I'm not sure what distinction you're getting at. What I would say is that I do hold by the principle that you can only study something if it somehow has an observable impact on the world. So let's frame this with respect to, say, the behaviorism versus cognitivism debates of the late 20th century. The behaviorists said you can only study behavior because we can't observe cognition. And then the cognitive revolution said, no, we can study cognition because there are definitely internal states in the brain that are something more than the behavior itself. And I agree with that. Everyone, I think, agrees with that now. But it's important to remember that that cognitive revolution still relied on the fact that we had other measures, other empirical observable things that those internal cognitive processes drove. So there were ways via behavior, via neuroscience, of actually observing the impact of those cognitive processes. That's why it was valid to reintroduce mental states into brain sciences, into psychology, because the behaviorists were wrong that there was no way to measure these things. But where I agree with the behaviorists is if you have something that you cannot measure, that has no discernible empirical impact on the world, it is not available for scientific inquiry. So if we take the example of subjective experience, I've really come around on this. I guess, on some level, I'm convinced by Chalmers. Like, I think that if our definition of subjective experience is if the way we use the word is such that it can have no impact on the world theoretically, then as far as I'm concerned, we can't study subjective experience scientifically. The only way we can study scientifically is if we accept it as something that has an empirical ramification. Then you can study it scientifically. So on all these questions, the dividing line that I'm drawing is between that which we can actually have a metric for and that which we cannot. And if we cannot have a metric for it, then I don't think we can study it scientifically or define it scientifically.
Okay, Anna Strasser has a question. I have a quip before she asks a question. Okay, so I am an oyster.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an oyster.
Mm-hmm.
And when you pinch me, it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
You cannot see that it hurts me. And so you
Mhm.
conclude that because there's no measurable way to find out whether it hurts me, you can do whatever you like with me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, that's exactly how people operate.
So it's my tough luck that you can't observe it. That's it. That's
Yes.
the bottom line.
Yeah, that's the bottom
Okay,
line.
gotcha. Okay, Anna, it's your turn.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So can you imagine that nonetheless Turing test-like tests could provide interesting results if we use such tests to test the extent to which humans are able to distinguish between machines and humans as conversation partners? Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, Anna. I guess I will agree to that, yes. So there might be an important role for Turing test style tests, specifically as in the vein of CAPTCHAs. Basically, as we move forward in our society, with a lot of our engagements with each other taking place online, the extent to which we can have tests that really tell us something about our ability to distinguish between human and AI systems for the practical purpose of distinguishing them online, I think that's very useful. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now from Yana. So what is the value of scientific abstractions if some concepts are left undefined to balance between definitions versus anarchy, disorganization? Yeah, so look, scientific abstractions and definitions are obviously very useful, but the key is, as I said, people adopting these definitions. So, when researchers kind of redefined entropy with statistical mechanics as the number of potential states, microstates that the system might be in, that was a valid scientific term because it became widely adopted within physics. And it was widely adopted because of the utility of that definition. And so if a similar thing happens with understanding, then I will say that some of what I've said here doesn't hold. Like if there is a scientist, if there's a theorist who defines understanding in a way that everyone kind of goes, oh, that's really useful, and that actually makes a whole lot of other things make sense, and then the field as a whole adopts that definition, great, then I think we're off to the races, and that's awesome. My personal guess is it won't happen with a word like understanding, because I think, unlike a word like entropy, there's too much sociological baggage around this word for people to actually accept such a redefinition. But maybe I'm wrong. And in that case, that additional layer of abstraction might be helpful for us. Okay. When you say that LLM will reach the level of human understanding in a few years, I wonder which group of humans you're referring to. But I never said that LLMs will reach human understanding in a few years. I said LLMs will pass whatever benchmark you throw at it at some point in time. But let me continue with the question. The world we see and perceive is not the world, but a world that we create with others, and it seems that you share this view as well. So the debate I am raising here is not whether AI understands as much or better than us, but what do we do with this knowledge and these technologies? And this level of understanding of knowledge about knowledge, which we are capable of, I do not think AI can achieve. My reaction to that is, again, like, it depends on what you mean by that statement. Will AI have knowledge about its knowledge and understand in the way that you're using the word? I don't know. It sounds like you have your own personal definition of the word understand, but as I said, that doesn't hold. A definition only holds as much as it is widely adopted by the community. So whatever your understanding of the word understand is, your usage of it is, the extent to which that gets reflected by the community as a whole determines whether or not that claim then becomes a scientifically valid claim. And I think that my key point here is that if you give me a benchmark for this definition, let's say you say, okay, it's knowledge, about having knowledge or something like that, and you come up with a benchmark to measure that, I guarantee you that at some point engineers will be able to pass your benchmark, basically. And then you're going to be faced with, do you change your definition or now accept that now they do understand, right?
Okay.
Julia's, yeah, sorry.
No, hang on. We have two hands and they get.
Oh, okay, very good.
So, Steve, go ahead. You're promoted. You can show your face and you can talk.
Yeah, any chance I could get video, or is that?
Yes, turn on your face and it'll be there.
Okay. Yeah, hi, Blake. I'm Steve Hansen. Nice to meet you. Great talk.
You too. Thank you.
I'm sort of one of the early connectionists from long ago, and I had read your paper with your colleagues called Neuroconnectionism, which I found kind of interesting, although it kind of also picks up on the way we define connectionism in the beginning. And of course, it comes into this, and it will back into a lot of things you're saying. If you give me a second, it comes into this. Oh, I'm getting a note from Steve.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I just want you to turn on your face.
I did.
I don't know why I didn't.
Oh, there he is. No,
There
he just came. He just appeared.
Yeah, it's a trick Stephen has. So magic. So what's really, and I'm in agreement. I love your neuroconnection. I love this kind of renaissance of this, and it's partly due to deep learning, and since 2005 or so.
Yeah.
But the problem you point out in that paper, which is still with us, is that the level of biophysics and the level of, let's call, computational neuroscience. So I run a brain imaging center, so I worry a lot about computational neuroscience, and even down to the cell level sometimes. But there's obviously this huge disconnect, and I think you call it the Goldilocks zone or something.
Yes, that's right.
and something I've talked to Jeff Hinton quite about is why these things are still so ridiculously, stupidly away from the actual biology. Why did we get away so far? And basically the scale is interesting, but these aren't neurons, these aren't neural circuits. And unless somebody figures out how to crack the code and get inside of an LLM and pull out the attention heads and start to lesion them and figure out what the hell's going on. As you point out, it's pointless to start talking about, these understanding and these words because they don't mean anything in this context unless we have some mechanistic account. But if we believe deep learning is sort of like the kind of apex of stuff here, then we're so far away from the brain. I mean, even Jeff is saying this has nothing to do with, he's still trying to figure out how to make backpropagation biologically plausible. So I just think, there's this disassociation, and that's part of the problem of identifying any kind of states or processing accounts that my neuroscience friends just would ignore because we're talking about cartoon things.
Yeah, so I can comment on that. I'll tell you my take. So first of all, I'll just note people are doing exactly what you mentioned. They're doing neuroscience on LLMs. There's a whole field called mechanistic interpretability that's doing exactly that, doing lesioning, doing various imaging tests, basically, and examining how these systems are actually solving these problems. I've got some students doing research in exactly this area. With regards to the biological correspondence, actually, Jeff had a big impact on me this way. And so I don't know if this will therefore be a satisfying answer to you, but I can tell you that I actually think that the vast majority of the biology that these networks are missing is not important for the question of modeling the algorithms that are occurring in the brain. So I've done a lot of research using both artificial neural networks and biophysical models, and I've done a lot of low-level patch clamping and systems neuroscience and all this kind of stuff. And I can tell you right now that neurons are actually very well approximated by a linear sum followed by a nonlinear activation function. It's not a perfect model of it, but it's actually a very reasonable abstraction. Certainly as reasonable as any of the other abstractions we use in modeling.
Like I'm aware of that. I'm sitting in a building with 50 neuroscientists who would disagree with you, but that's beside the point.
But those neuroscientists have to sorry, yeah.
They're more complicated. I'm sorry.
The real neurons are definitely more complicated. And,
okay.
And as someone who's done, I can tell you, I've done a lot of work on nonlinearities and dendrites. I know that the actual biophysical computations happening in neurons have all sorts of additional layers of complexity that our artificial neural networks don't. But what I'm arguing is not that they are a perfect model, but that, look, all models are an abstraction. Even a biophysical model of a neuron is missing all sorts of biological details, right? Where are the proteins and their folding? Where are the gene expression pathways? It's not there in the model. So why is cable theory a valid model of a neuron and not an ANN unit? It's just about the degree of abstraction you're going to employ. Now, this is where Jeff's had an impact on me and why we argue for the Goldilocks zone in that paper that you mentioned. So you have to decide on your level of abstraction when you're modeling these systems. And what I've been telling neuroscientists for the last decade is that those biophysical models you know and love, and which I also love in many ways, they're actually not useful for really understanding the connection between cognition and neural circuits because they're too detailed. They're not abstract enough because they're not tractable in a manner that allows us to get it to actually generate complex behaviors. You can wire up a circuit of biophysically realistic neurons and they do nothing. It doesn't recognize images. It doesn't produce language. It doesn't have any behavioral resemblance to a human being. So if we want a theory that actually connects neural computation to behavior, we need a model that is abstract enough that it's tractable for us to train up on complicated tasks, but still not so abstract that it doesn't resemble neurons on some level. And my argument would be that AMNs are actually in that Goldilocks zone. They are abstract enough that they're tractable for us to get them to do useful things, but not so abstract that they actually don't resemble neural computation on some level.
One last thing. Okay.
Yeah.
It has to be the last thing because
This
you.
will be the last thing. I'm sorry. One last thing. Well, of course, we've known that since the 1980s. Nothing changed.
Nothing changed. No.
Okay, that's agreed.
That's agreed. That's agreed. Yes. No, I will happily say that. People have said this since the 1980s, since hell, the 1950s. It has always been true, but sometimes you have to say things 1,000 times over multiple
Okay,
generations.
that's one time more. Now go back to the comments, please. Go back to the comments.
Oh, yes. Sorry, Julia. Just a thought. Personally, I still want to convince myself of what is alive and what is conscious and what understands, regardless of how poorly defined those things may be, even if it may be the case that there is a continuum. Personally, they feel like meaningful states. If other people feel the same way, then figuring out why could be a piece of the puzzle. And regarding the Bongard problems in yesterday's discussion with Gary Lupian, the answer GPT-4o gave re a matrix IQ test question was seemingly wrong. The reasoning it gave about it didn't make sense, and its description of the appearance of the symbols in the answer was inaccurate, even though it said it was probably in the training data. It's interesting that GPT-4o, as opposed to earlier GPT models, is more verbose in its answers, maybe as if it has been nudged towards using chain of thought prompting. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it has been. But look, I maintain, so it's very important and super valid to do exactly that, to test the capabilities of these models. And so you can identify with these matrix tests a clear gap between human cognition and LLM cognition. And then it's very reasonable to say, therefore, humans have this capability that these LLMs don't. But my answer, as always, is, well, I don't want to use that test to then say whether this system understands altogether. Per the original question, I'm happy to say that it didn't understand that question, the matrix question, but not that it doesn't understand anything. And secondly, I really do think you're going to find people that don't pass that test. And so does that mean they don't understand anything? Surely not. Rather, we should say it's just that they don't understand that one test. And regarding the start of your question, the sort of comment of wanting to understand these things and feeling like they're important. It's not that they're not important. I want to emphasize, obviously the concept of being alive is important, and we care about whether something's alive or not. My point is rather that science is not how we carve that up. We don't make the decision about whether or not something's alive or not based on science, really. We make the decision based upon just our usage of the word. And that's appropriate. And I think we'll do the same with thought and understanding. Okay.
Just 1 second. Yeah, Hook, and then if you want to make a comment, please write it, because now we're running out of time, and it'll go faster if you do a short comment written. I can't recognize your hand live. Go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so now from David, thus you probably do not think that LLMs can provide an answer to the question, how do humans understand? Yeah, I don't think LLMs can answer that question, because we can't answer that question, and their knowledge derives solely from our knowledge. This is one area where I really like Alison Gopnik's take. She says these LLMs are best understood as cultural artifacts, and though I think she sometimes takes that interpretation farther than I would go, she's fundamentally right about the fact that all of their understanding of the world, if we want to call it that, or rather all of their capabilities, that's what I'd prefer to call it, are derived from what they can extract from the human knowledge placed online. And so if you can't find the answer to the question, how do humans understand online, LLMs ain't going to answer it for you. Okay, from Vishnu now.
Blake, could you, we have only 10 minutes left. Could you slide down to the bottom and answer the anonymous attendee and then work back up again?
Okay, sure. Okay, because I'm curious to know more about your take on an embodied Turing test. Do you think there's something more than simple mapping from environmental inputs to behavior in these upcoming virtual models and robots? It still feels to me there is a gap from formal simulations to the biological computational efficiency of animals. Do you think this gap could be filled by computational means only? So the answer to your last question is yes, absolutely. I am a computationalist. I am a functionalist. I do not think that there is any question about there being a non-computational theory of cognition. I don't even really know what that means unless you're committing to some kind of mysticism. And I know various thinkers have answers to that and say, oh, no, here's my non-computational, non-mystical theory. But it always just looks to me either mystical or, in fact, computational. I've never seen a single theory that actually I recognize as being non-computational and non-mystical. But to come back to this question of the embodied Turing test. So I just want to say, I don't know if I've ever said this to Stephen. I remember reading his work on the total Turing test when I was a student in cognitive science. And it in part inspired some of the work we did on the embodied Turing test recently. The reason I think the embodied Turing test is a really interesting test is not because I want to use it to determine understanding necessarily, but I think personally, it can get at some of the core gaps currently between AI systems and real brains in terms of their capabilities. You know, LLMs are remarkably good at generating language, but they're not, you know, successfully picking up glassware and putting it in the dishwasher. And I think these more simple embodied tests are actually much more illuminating for where the gaps currently exist between AI capabilities and humans.
Okay, Jan put in his comment written. He wants to know whether the what Pulvermüller, Jan, by the way, Friedman Pulvermüller is here. He recommended Hebbian learning over back, or seemed to over backprop. What's your thinking of that?
Well, to be clear, it depends on what he means by Hebbian learning. So I don't want to put you know, any words into his mouth. But if you're talking about classic Hebbian learning from computational neuroscience, no, Hebbian learning sucks. It doesn't learn anything useful. There's a reason that we don't use it in artificial neural networks. Now, I have been someone who has spent the last decade studying the question of how to develop algorithms that can do as well as backpropagation, but using fully local signals. And I know Pulvermüller has done some of this work as well. I think what we can say is there are ways to get approximations to the gradient that involve local calculations rather than error backpropagation. And I am personally confident that the brain uses such an algorithm. But what I will say is that for AI purposes, I actually think we don't need to worry about this because I actually think that the general principle holds that if you can estimate the gradient, great, but if you can calculate it directly, even better. Gradient descent works well. It works really well. It's an excellent algorithm for stuffing information into a network.
So go ahead.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, I think you would like me to comment on this direct. Okay, your implicit question: what kind of Hebbian learning? Of course, it should not be wired together, fire together only.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Essential to have a weakening term included. So out of sync, the link is necessary. LTD, long-term depression, if one neuron fires but not the other one, then so either the one downstream from the synapse or the one or the input neuron does not fire and the other one fires, then there's weakening of the synapse and only then interesting behavior is generated. I think you mentioned that wire together, old, simple Hebbian learning is not so useful. I agree, but
Yeah.
But the more sophisticated one is quite of interest, and I would say error backpropagation sometimes runs into a problem related to the concept of an error. For example, generations of linguists argue that the input given to children, to babies learning language, is not so essential. And indeed, there are cultures where there's very little feedback given. So
I can comment on a few
you
of
know
those
this
things.
argument.
I know this argument. So first I want to comment.
And there are
Very good.
obvious things that if we speak and hear ourselves speaking, there's correlated activation on two ends of the brain, and that must lead to some learning and not backpropagation learning, but fire together, wire together type of learning.
Well, so okay, I've got several things to say to this. There's so many layers
Right.
here. You'll excuse me. I get excited about this because this is exactly my area of
Yeah,
interest.
me too.
So I agree with you that you can accomplish more interesting things when you start to include additional long-term depression terms in your equations for your weight updates, but still you cannot train a network as well as you can with backprop. No one, and I say this with confidence, no one has yet to show a Hebbian learning algorithm of any sort that matches the performance of backpropagation when it comes to just achieving a particular input-output function.
But is this an argument? This is an argument to an engineer, but not to a biologist.
Right. So agreed. So this is an argument to an engineer. This is why I'm saying an AI engineer doesn't have to worry about this stuff because they've got this excellent algorithm. So use it. Now, for biology, though, you're absolutely right that like we know the brain can't do backpropagation itself. That's just a given. If you explore the terms of backpropagation, it's clear that it doesn't happen. But I don't think the key question is with respect to error. Like, in fact, take the language learning example you gave. One of the fascinating things about LLMs, I would argue, is that they demonstrate that the original poverty of the stimulus argument from the linguists is nonsense. They originally argued that you couldn't learn human syntax from positive examples alone because you don't receive this negative feedback saying, no, that's not a correct sentence. This is a correct sentence. That's not a correct sentence. And so they said, all you'd receive is a bunch of examples, and you cannot learn a context-free grammar from these positive examples. But what we've seen with LLMs is that actually, if your loss is just predict the next word, you can learn syntax. These systems, if they can do anything, they can do syntax, man. They produce syntactically correct sentences all the time at exactly the frequency that you'd expect from a human being.
Public announcement.
I think the problem...
Just a second. Blake has not been present at any of these sessions. The first week was devoted to all of this, and he doesn't know that. Maybe he'll change his mind. Go ahead, Friedemann.
The point, the very brief point, I have 5 points to make, but let me just make one little remark. The poverty of the stimulus is not replicated in GPT. That's the opposite. That's overflowing richness of input. An infant, a child, has never available to themselves.
Can I respond directly to that point? There's two different
data.
versions of the poverty of the stimulus argument. The old school one was about the lack of negative examples, which is what you raised. And that's the one that I'm saying is overturned. You're correct that when we simply measure the quantity of data, LLMs get way more. Agreed.
Well, but is this... But I think we agree that the typical LLM these days gets a lot of input, but the child does not get so much input.
Well, the child, to be clear, gets a lot of input, but not as much as LLMs. You're right.
And therefore the poverty is not implemented in LLM models. There are now to try this with the child's database, for example.
But children are not blank slates, right? So this is where I do agree with the linguists. Children are not blank slates, but where I disagree with the linguists is I don't think the best way to understand it is that they have a hardwired universal grammar. Rather, the best way to understand them is that they are a pre-trained neural network. Evolution has pre-trained them. And I guarantee you that if you took an LLM that had been pre-trained and then you gave it an equivalent amount of inputs that a child gets, it would probably learn a language quite well. So we're not comparing apples to apples when we compare an LLM trained from blank slate to a child with a rich genetic heritage.
Well, so one thing I think we agree that at the moment LLM models get too much input to be comparable with the child. Second point, poverty of the stimulus is indeed a problem if you consider Hebbian learning. If you think if you have two words in a string, then they belong together and you strengthen some kind of connection between the two. However, as soon as you realize that we also have anti-Hebbian learning, we immediately see that whenever word A does not co-occur with word B, then any link between the representation of A and B weakens. And this is the kind of negative evidence linguists of a new type, so-called construction grammarians, have pointed to since 10 years, meanwhile, or 20. And this is so the old idea of Chomsky of lack of evidence. I think this has been rethought, and I think there is negative evidence exactly of that LTD sort, which Hebbian learning exploits.
Right, but I would argue that backpropagation can exploit that same signal. So like I'm fully in agreement with you, but backpropagation is fully capable of exploiting that same
You
piece
can
of
always
information.
find an engineering solution which is even quicker than biology, no problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we're largely in agreement. And I'll say, Stephen, no, I didn't see the other talks, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say I know a lot of what they were saying. And I probably don't agree with some of the takes, basically. I think you can still show all sorts of ways in which LLMs are different from human beings in terms of their capabilities. And I don't disagree with that. I'm not arguing they have equivalent capabilities. But I stand by the claim. We can now say that you can learn syntax from positive examples alone.
Yeah. But I still would like to remark that there's a lot of still need of discussion between linguists and neural network people. On last week Tuesday, for example, there was great disagreement about the claim that GPT now claims that language can be learned without a universal grammar.
So I've followed these discussions, and I just come down hard on the side of no, actually they do show that. I don't buy the arguments against it. I have personally never been convinced. I in all the linguistics classes I took, in the psycholinguistics classes I took, in the computational linguistics classes I took, every time I encountered Chomskyan theories of language, I found them completely unconvincing. I don't really buy these theories, but that's my personal take. I know others find them convincing, but I've never found the arguments adequate to change my mind. I think that what we see in human learning is evidence of a lot of the same pathologies that come from systems like LLMs that learn from positive examples alone. And then there are going to be differences, but that's because we're different from LLMs. We have a different genetic heritage. And so that's, as I said, where I agree with Chomsky and linguists and with linguists. And I do agree with you, Friedemann, that the more that linguists and computational people can talk to each other, the better. But I will say that, somewhat controversially, I think and I apologize right now for saying this, I think the conversation will go better once Chomsky retires or dies. I think that there has been a blockage in the discussion that was created by the cult of personality around Noam Chomsky and the inability of linguists to hear critiques of his theories.
I'm not
Okay,
sure.
I think we have to cut it off there.
That's a bit of a weird place to end, but yeah, okay.
So this can be taken up again. It's not over. The panel will take up some of these questions as well.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you all. They're fascinating questions.
Thank you too.
Yes, thanks, Friedemann.